Mm, 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 mm. Hello, Nancy. Mm, mm. Mm. Hmm.
Welcome, everybody. We're just gonna wait another minute or two for more people to join.
Hmm. Okay.
Hello, welcome, everybody. I'm Tracy, founding editor and director of Litmus Press. I'm really pleased to be celebrating Will Alexander's work tonight with New Directions and City Lights. First off, I'd like to acknowledge the staff of both of those presses who helped us get the word out for the event, as well as our own staff who are assisting us tonight. One of our editors, Miriam Atkin, and one of our editorial fellows, Alicia Slocum. We'll be sharing links, moderating the chat and the Q&A afterwards. Just a few quick logistics. We've enabled live captioning. So if you need that, you can turn it on in your Zoom control panel. We're also recording and live streaming via YouTube. So if you'd like to turn your camera off, you can do that as well. Feel free to use the chat during the readings and presentations, but for questions that you would like us to share with the panelists at the end, we ask that you use the Q&A function also on your Zoom control panel. So unfortunately, Jeffrey Wang from New Directions couldn't be with us this evening, but Garrett Caples from City Lights is here and I think would like to say a few words.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Tracy. I wanted to just say hello to everyone from City Lights, and I just wanted to acknowledge I've known Will for almost 30 years, 28, I think, because I think we met in 1995. And I've had the privilege of editing and publishing a couple of books of his at City Lights over the years, one of which is Compression and Purity, which was volume 5 in our Spotlight series. And his most recent one is Divine Blue Light, which was number 62 in the Pocket Poet series. And I was really thrilled beyond belief to get Will into the Pocket Poet series. He's one of the greatest poets writing in English today, one of the all-time great surrealist period. And words generally fail me when I try to describe his work. So instead, I just want to say that City Lights is proud to be one of Will's publishers. And we've been supporting him, alongside New Directions, which has always been a sort of sister press to City Lights. And, but even more importantly, the amazing small presses that have been supporting Will this whole time since 1995, and especially Litmus, who is putting his new book out now. And I just wanted to thank Tracy and everyone at Litmus for doing all the real work in putting this on. And I'm really looking forward to hearing what everyone has to say. So I will turn it back over to Tracy, but thank you all for coming, and thank you, Will, for being who you are.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Garrett. Yeah, I was thinking about it too. I think I've known Will for 25 years, although I don't expect you to remember our first meeting, Will, but that was introduced by Leslie Scalpino at Mills in gosh, maybe 97 or something like that. And so yeah, very young, impressionable poet, and I was blasted with Leslie Scalpino and then Will Alexander's work, which was really brilliant, of course. And I just, my small anecdote with Will's work, because it's such a pleasure to work with you editorially, Will, and I do have Leslie to thank for so much of that.
You have everything to thank for her. Yeah, it's been
Yeah.
organic, really organic.
Yeah.
Incredibly
And
organic.
so 25 years ago, exactly, really, because Towards the Primeval Lightning Field came out in 98. And so I was working for Leslie as an intern. And that was the first manuscript she handed me to copy edit. And so I went, which was, I was sort of, I didn't know what to do at first. And I was remembering, she kept asking me, why was it taking me so long to return the manuscript to her? And as I was thinking about that, just sort of introducing this evening, I was thinking of all of the questions that arise in the coming mental range. So sort of imagining responding to Leslie's question about why it was taking me so long with some of these questions, which I'll just read. They're out of order and sort of random from the book. But where are the minds with darting commas which breathe by imaginal respiration full of radiant constellations? What comprises energy that ascribes itself to the curious dictation of lenses? Stricken palabras, a whale seeking refuge from waters roiled by human imprecation? So am I under the gaze of my own vapor, under self-translated peril, overwhelming myself by shadow? Or am I burning as neurotic candle through contagion? But the questions always arise. Why is there being? Why is there something other than nothing? And this is not the tremblings from some bloodless grammarian fraught by pictorial embellishment. Again, why is there being? So it is asked, what of the Oneric lightning palace? What of the factors that shifted to form Gondwana land? So as part of one's quantum persona, one could call oneself poetic practitioner of the occult, linking one's internal weather to 4 private suns. And these suns open themselves above random canals, bringing to water inscrutable genetics, which magically build and vanish. And in the building of this water, there is the flashing of ignited pepper trees, of scarlet ligneous apparitions. Sometimes the wood flashes blue or turns purple, as would a paradoxical lightning pole. One can call these signs impalpable flares that pre-exist. This is light being squared by phantom technical sands, evolving in themselves, being salt which burns and spins in itself as organic carbon distillation raised to their own nths. This is the mind furtively kindled by hieroglyphical gestation, this process being nothing other than an evolving level of witness. One must respond by making up thought from a kind of witness rampant in Andromeda. Or do such beings exist who cohere on the other side of the sombrero galaxy, thereby understanding one's view as being clarified by the uncanny, so that integers are splayed and take up the tone of parsecs, simultaneously moving to higher destinal concern? Thus, one illumines the dark with variations on energy. So, celebrating 3 of Will's recent publications. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes. Always a pleasure to just dive in to your work, Will.
Yeah, I try to keep it as a stream. This is the way I work. It's always a stream. I just dive into it.
Yeah.
And wherever I pick up the stream, it picks up simultaneously.
Yeah, and I think that one of the reasons I really wanted to bring us together in the three presses and these three recent works is I think you are sort of working on all at the same time and the same different kind of modalities and manifestations of this thinking and all of the interconnections that just are really just the sort of breadth and depth of your work. And so I'm really excited to be celebrating these three books kind of together in concert this evening. So I'd also like to extend a very warm welcome to our stellar array of panelists this evening. Thank you all so much for being here. I'll read brief bios for each of the panelists in the order that they'll sort of read or present. And then Hazem Fahmy, who's another one of our editorial fellows, will introduce Will. And then Andrew, I think you're up first, so you can just take it from there.
Sure.
Andrew Joran is a poet, essayist, and speculative fiction writer. His poetry collections include The Absolute Letter from Flood Editions and Trance Archive, New and Selected Poems from City Lights. His work of speculative fiction, O0, was published by Black Square Editions in 2022. Joran teaches creative writing at San Francisco State University. Marcella Durand is the author of several books of poetry, including To Husband is to Tender, Black Square Editions, and The Prospect, Delete Press, as well as a translation of Michel Metai's book-length poem, Earth's Horizons, Les Horizons du Sol, Black Square Editions 2020. She's the 2021 recipient of the C.D. Wright Award in Poetry from the Foundation of Contemporary Art. Anthony Seidman is a poet translator from Los Angeles. His most recent publications are That Beast in the Mirror, Black Herald Press, a bilingual gathering of his poetry with translations into French by Blandine Long, and a translation of Rodolfo Hinostroza's landmark book Contra Natura, Cardboard House Press, which won the Maldor Prize in 1971 with Octavio Paz as the judge. Justin Demong is chairman of the Before Columbus Foundation and administrator of the American Book Award. His work has been published in Americana, Black Renaissance Noir, Drum Voices Review, A Gathering of Tribes, Conj Musicology, and Paris Lit. And finally, to introduce Will Alexander, Hazem Fahmy is a writer and critic from Cairo, and he is currently pursuing his PhD in Middle Eastern Studies at Columbia University. Hazem will introduce Will, and then Andrew can get us going.
Thanks, Tracy. What a pleasure. Born in Los Angeles, California in 1948, Will Alexander earned a BA in English and Creative Writing from UCLA in 1972. In addition to publishing over 24 works, he has taught at many colleges and universities, including the Jack Kerouac School of Disembodied Poetics, the University of California, and Hofstra University, and others. He was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in Poetry in 2022 for Refractive Africa, and his other, one of the books that we're celebrating today, of course, and his other honors include a Whitting Fellowship for Poetry, a California Arts Council Fellowship, and the 2016 Jackson Poetry Prize. Writing on his work last year, the New York Times praised Alexander for his mix of, quote, politics with mesmeric oracular lines, end quote. For this poet, novelist, essayist, playwright, visual artist, and pianist, philosophy means inquiry into the broadest view, into the most encompassing range, taking into account the known and what is considered to be the unknown. This malleable and generous approach is also what animates the Angelino writer's poetics, defined by the understanding that poetry is aboriginal utterance. The convergence of these two principles animates the three titles we're celebrating today: Refractive Africa, Ballet of the Forgotten, Divine Blue for John Coltrane, and The Coming Mental Range. The first two, published by New Directions and City Lights respectively, have been praised for their, quote, improvisatory cosmicity, which pushes poetic language to the point of most resistance, incantatory and swirling with magical laterality and recovery, end quote. And published by Litmus, The Coming Mental Range is Alexander's latest collection. exploding the lines between the poem and the essay, seamlessly weaving the lyrical and the philosophical together in a searing exploration of our intellectual and political past, present, and future. Within the pieces of the book, poetry emerges as a force almost beyond classification, one that by its very nature destabilizes. This is as much a theorization as it is a promise. Alexander's words have long destabilized our comfort and normatively held assumptions. The pieces in this book especially compel the reader to put it down and pick it back up again, to endlessly return to a text that refuses stasis. This is a book that is highly attuned to the body, uninterested in any attempt at separating it from the mind. The writer's observations are never fully abstracted from the sensorial, and the reader can feel each overlapping thought process unfolding under the skin. Through these kinds of ruptures, Alexander's writing opens up the political, tackling racism as an infection preventing us from practicing the true alchemy of the species. In inviting us to look and tumble inwards, Alexander attempts no straightforward solution to set grievances, but rather reminds us of the radical nature of what lies within. So grateful to have gotten this opportunity to present Will, and I'm so excited to join you all in hearing his amazing work. Thank you.
Thank you.
Andrew, if you want to start us off, I don't know if you want to read or
Yeah, no, I'm just say a few words.
Yeah.
My contact with Will goes back to the early 80s when I was editing a poetry magazine that he submitted some work to, and we've been collaborating ever since, not only as poets, but as musicians. As many of you know, Will is a piano player, and I played the theremin. Maybe you can see the theremin in the background here. Will and I most recently did a musical and poetic conjunction in the hills of Berkeley, California. We were hosted by a man who has a reading and music series in his home. So Will and I played some music and read some poetry there in April. So yeah, we've been in close contact for a long time, and always inspirational to interact with Will. I'm going to read something that I wrote about Will. It'll touch on some of the same biographical details that Hazem touched on, but just to give us a rundown, I will read this. Will Alexander was born and raised in Los Angeles and resides there to this day. He alludes to a painful process of self-education in his first book, Vertical Rainbow Climber. And I'm quoting now, "Outside myself and bleeding on my own discoveries, I discover in a cave Pythagorean lodestones broken in the air of Chaldean snake myths," end quote. During those years of self-discovery, Alexander found himself becoming the conduit for a primal and oracular speech. The visionary writings of Will Alexander participate in, but can hardly be confined to, the Pan-African Surrealist tradition of Aimé Césaire. The explosion of his language engulfs almost every continent and sweeps away the categories that separate poetry and philosophy, myth and science. As a young man, Alexander attended UCLA and participated in the political and literary tumult of 60s culture in Los Angeles. Along the way, he met and befriended other Surrealist poets, most notably Philip Lamantia and Jane Cortez, as well as making contact with members of the Chicago Surrealist group. While still in high school, Alexander became aware of the active jazz scene in Los Angeles, sneaking into clubs as an underage youth and conversing with many prominent musicians. The link between jazz improvisation and Surrealist automatism, never fully explored by the Paris Surrealists, has always been emphasized by American Surrealists and is strongly manifested in the writings of Will Alexander. But it wasn't until somewhat later in his life that Alexander began to play music himself, performing on piano. He'd taken lessons as a child in jazz and experimental music milieus. Since the publication of Vertical Rainbow Climber in 1987, Alexander has authored dozens of books and risen to international prominence. While most of Alexander's works consist of poetry collections, he has also published several volumes of essays and plays. In all of these works, the fiery metamorphic substance of Alexander's style remains constant, whether poured into the vessel of a poem, an essay, or a play. Likewise, even as much of his work gives high priority to representing the shape-shifting propensities of being, Alexander's own identity as poetic maker has remained remarkably constant over the course of his career. An extract from his earliest book could be set beside another from his latest to demonstrate the essential continuity of a voice that seems to have emerged once and for all, forged in some cataclysm akin to the one that created the chemical elements. At the same time, Alexander's voice speaks to its situation, social, political, ecological, in the Anthropocene. Perhaps such a voice could only have emerged as the world system is poised to undergo a phase shift into some new and unprecedented configuration. Indeed, the apocalyptic qualities of this shift are clearly mirrored in the configuration of Alexander's words. Anticipating a collective leap of human consciousness comparable to the mind's original emergence in Africa, Alexander reports on the world as it is today, as if from a standpoint in the future, from an alterity in which this momentous leap has already occurred. As the partisan of energy, as a form of imagination, Alexander relentlessly critiques linear conceptions of cause and effect, along with all mechanistic modalities of thought and practice. For Alexander, such modalities represent enslavements of energy, the imposition of grid-like coordinate patterns upon a free-flowing and infinite substance. Alexander upholds surrealism and African animism in particular as exemplary of the imagination engaged in struggle against what Manuel de Landa has called linear equilibrium structures. Against the linear babbles, it's a quote, of alienated discourses, Alexander argues for a, quote, a new perpendicular burst, transmuting in demeanor, end quote, for a language in which the vocabularies of magic and science become, once again, but as never before, interchangeable. The force of Alexander's creative imagination is such that it must overflow the limits of language itself, taking the forms of visual art and music. Alexander's artworks, reproduced on the covers of many of his books, undulate with biomorphic patterns at once abstract and figurative that recall the work of Miro and Mata. In the broad spectrum of Alexander's practice, light transmutes into sound, as the notes of his piano playing, often a series of meditative harmonic progressions, seem to follow the complex flow of his drawings and paintings. The work of Will Alexander shows what a unified field theory of the creative imagination must look like, prefiguring the evolutionary, revolutionary leap on which our survival depends.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Hi, I'm so delighted to be here. I don't see Will often enough, and I remember the exact
Hello.
moment when I first met him on the balcony of the Poetry Project at St. Mark's Church when he had flown in from LA to read with Samuel Delaney, and I think you all can guess what an incredible reading that was. I think that was in 1997, and I, you know, whenever I just feel completely in despair about the world, I think of Will and that he exists over in LA, and I feel always a connection thrumming there, and I feel so much grounded that the world has something that has Will in it, and that we communicate on many different levels, if not necessarily on the same coast in the physical realm. So there are times I have thought I should call Will, and then he calls, and this has happened. So I'm eager to read the first essay in this, which I just received a few days ago, and I eagerly sat down on my couch and read this first essay, which conveys so much of what I think about Will, and I just find such an exciting, pertinent, astute essay for immediacy today. So the coming mental range, I'm going to read as much as I can in this time. All error proceeds from ignorance or haste, Ferdinando Pessoa. And excuse me, any, I mispronounce things when I'm nervous. And as you know, Will uses a lot of words that I get nervous and mispronounce them.
Don't worry about it.
Alternate pronunciations. Are circumstances fouled by protracted haste, by that which aspires to some form of clinical security? I am thinking of the quest to inhabit Mars within a foreseeable time frame. The question arises, does ciceration amongst the northern elites strive for an isolated colony where the populace from the southern cone is surgically omitted? This is something to contemplate given the prevailing wreckage that now consumes all corners of the earth, rife with chronic patterns of extinction that ranges from the condition of bees to the ominous breakage of icebergs to the volatile scattering of humans from refuge to refuge. A daunting condition, to say the least. So what Elon Musk proposes seems as pointed towards the future as some multi-planetary exercise. Yet, in our present context, it feels at bottom as if it were nothing other than a skittish trope grasping for salvation for the financially appointed. The zeitgeist persists across what I consider to be an expanding terminal phase, with our basic neurology being called into question. Human crossing of the solar system seems escape beyond the calliope that reminds continuing earthly dread. It feels as though the void implies our every breath, history being nothing other than a concert that repatterns each of our momentary efforts. This remains the gist for all outward escape. History of Via, our continuing terror, combines terminal posturing, bringing forth the chemistry of wealth and speculation, transmitted as synecdoche, confined to the shadowy urn we understand to be the 1%. The latter populace crowned in the collective subderma by enforced consensus. In the end, the 1% exists as none other than elite refugees themselves seeking escape from the planetary wreckage they have so willfully spawned. With the secular state now barely alive as a graceless sub-functioning order, with each of its individual components functioning as none other than particularized sub-functioning fiefdoms. The latter being none other than a moribund cellular confine incapable of spontaneous electricity, stands the power of transmutation. Such a state is not inclined towards movement via sattvic acreage in the cells. I am thinking of such acreage as transparence with its impalpable planes of respiration, not unlike Cantoresque sub-infinities, allowing the body to transmute as a state into what I'll call shamanic volcanism. This is where the cells take on capability that ignites as transhuman possibilities, so that gulfs between voids become open to something other than acquiescent consumption, or the individual being stunted by its own self-erasure. At best, the collective has become conditioned to aspiring to brokered animal limit, to nothing other than experience as a briefly wrought body amassed through dysfunctional assemblage. Within this wrought consensus, there remains among a small gist of the populace the desire to export this dysfunction to a Martian soil torrential with inaudita and howling, attempting to replicate the error that remains the Anthropocene. To create through this replication a compound solar error is none other than unconscionable exploration. If the specific honings of the asteroid probes and similar attempts amount to nothing other than cosmic land speculation and graft, we have, in the end, wrought only a more pointed punctuation that signals further outgrowth of the Tamazic. As for the looming prospect of a human colony on Mars, it remains the target of immediate saturation leading to completion. Again, private models reign via Blue Origin, Space Dev, New Shepard, Virgin, Galactic, and Elon Musk's SpaceX, being momentary figurines that seem solely concerned with exteriorized result. For instance, there remains telling silence concerning the inner dimension of the soul. Their quest seems willing to ignore the soul and its confrontation Would the Martian scape and its unrelenting weather cycles as they consume the body, ultimately stranding its carcass on alien plateaus? The violence that accrues from such inclement isolation has not yet been considered. Highly efficient rocket boosters and possible pizza lodgings, the latter having been enunciated in passing as foreshortened ancillary effect of a stated industrial goal. What the Egyptians understood as being the 7 parts of the soul has been subsumed by the sterility that looms as business venture, as momentary profit. This will not suffice. If what is true of numerically projected galaxies ranging between 200 million at the low end and 2 trillion at the high end, this is an overwhelming range that can never be sufficiently explored by an ambitious but delimited techne. In the deepest sense, this seems a marked arrangement that projects, in my view, a reality that seems parallel as accessible analogy to the experimental implosion that was Roanoke. This is the template that seems to configure the Mars mission or any other similar configuration or any of the asteroids that portend mineral extraction. The latter policy persists as commercial projection. The point that seems to naturally accrue is one of missing inner respiration. There is the implementation of Musk's BFR rocket, with its powerful boosters lifting the body outside of its earthly habitation, yet never having discussion concerning the volcano that invigorates the soul. Thus, exo missions seem compromised by kind of abstract sterility, by the passage of life as sightless enterprise. When the Arctic shaman Awa speaks of Quamanek, the shaman light of brain and body, this is something that SpaceX or SpaceDev or Blue Origin has so far failed to consider. They possess a glossary compelled by quantification, by palpable excess honed in principle by micrometer. This being the state of official exploration, subtending itself via suicidal psychic clauses, via delimited transmission of psychophysical foodstuffs, and the result, a soullessness propounded via inclement animation, not unlike its homing ground of Euro-American cellular malaise, bereft as it is of the coming mental range, this latter range having at its heart the insight of the soul and its registration beyond quanta.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well,
Thank you for the reading. Yeah, thank you.
Perfect. It's absolute pleasure to be here celebrating Will's work. I met him, I think about 18 years ago. We met up at the Dresden room of all places. And although our initial conversations did hinge upon surrealism and then Francophone poets like Chikayu Tamsi, Robert Arivalo, during these past days that I've been pondering about what to speak about, I'd like to talk about some other voices that I perceive, some other traditions that are entrenched in his work. One does start with the Francophone poet the best. There really is this presence of the low speaking of the initiate into the ceremony being mounted and a voice speaking through him. Again, this idea of a mask, and I'm coming back to that. Will has always been for me a poet
Anthony, I'm not sure if you can hear us. You are frozen here. Let me just see if I can. Okay, maybe, let's just see. I'm thinking he's gonna come back in just a moment.
All right, I think I'm back.
Oh,
Am I
there,
back?
yes, you are.
Perfect.
Yes.
So again, I was just kind of doing a catalog of all these poems I've read, and again, the different masks, the theatrics, and I mean that in a very with a deep admiration. So what has struck me in my conversations with Will about Latin American poetry, that he also, I think, pertains very much to the Baroque, and perhaps to the American Baroque, which is a poetry and an art of proliferation, a poetry and art which is ornamental but not superficial, where the adjectives are multisyllabic, where things seem to be about to implode, yet at the same time, everything is floating. And so for perhaps that sense of improvisation that we see in Will, it's very much like these sheets of sound, this incredible barrage that is based also not just on intuition, but on a very careful carving. Obviously, the research that goes into his poems is something that is utterly amazing. So again, I'd like to establish Will into that tradition of the American Baroque. I'm thinking of canonical poets like Sor Juana. I'm thinking like poets like Lezama Lima, who like Will has an amazing body of work that is a rich thesaurus of countless references to diverse cultures, to diverse voices, and who also enters into the terrain of the essay and of the novel. In other words, Will is able to take advantage of all these voicings in order to seek these different masks. So I think he really gets to the idea of what poetry is when we get to the root of it in English, in Greek, the idea that it's the cement, the binder of things where contradictory affirmations can coexist. Nothing is affirmed as one necessary truth. And of course, I think this leads us to the many conversations I had with Will about Octavio Paz, this idea in Paz that I am another, the voice, the feet I hear walking on another street, that's where I am, where only the mist is real. Why I think he has his deep love for Lopez Velarde. Again, Velarde is able to situate his poetry in a type of nostalgic terrain of prior to the Mexican Revolution, but it is rendered through a language that is completely his own. If you're able to read Lopez Velarde in Spanish and compare the usage of, again, these heavy kind of marble-like adjectives that bind the lines, that bind the rhyme, and yet they're extremely supple as well as a reading experience. And of course, a lot of what I see in Will's poetry has to do with the Neo-Baroque, which is a movement in Latin America that came up, was given birth to by a landmark anthology edited by Jacobo Sefami, with poets like Eduardo Espina, again, a very Baroque, rich language, where the poem, the language itself of the poem is the event of the poem, as well as Carlos Germán Belí, who has not produced as many open sequences as Will, but his open sequence, Oada Cibernética, explores the political preoccupations of Will, the disaster of modern society, as much as it incorporates the language of poetry from various regions, centuries, and registers. And there's something about the language in Will's poetry, I can't put my finger on it. Sometimes I think of someone even like Samuel Greenberg, who is pasting together his own sense of poetry. And of course, his poetry was pilfered by Hart Crane, whose visions come across as entirely synthetic. And there's nothing that comes across as synthetic in Will's poetry. It's the real nerve. It's the true vein being opened. And again, I see so much with Latin American poets. For example, I think of the Dominican poet Pedro Mir, and one of his most important poems, Hay un país en el mundo, is really Hispaniola speaking. The island is speaking through the poet. And of course, then it makes me think of Asia and Haiti by Will, and Will's similar desire to explore the bloody history of that island. And in that poem by Pedro Mir, there are moments that share some of the same characteristics with the texture of Will's poetry, where sometimes we know what is being communicated, but it is smoke as well. It slips through our hands. It is something that we're mesmerized by. It is magical. The term for this by the Mexican critic and poet Alfonso Reyes was hintanjáfora, a characteristic of poetry where sound sometimes makes more sense than content, or where the sounds of the words and these unexpected juxtapositions, this melding of scientific along with quote unquote a lyrical poetic is something so unexpected. And so again, I am so fond of this element of the Baroque in Will, the idea of the mirror that opens to curtains, the idea that the mask that is being worn might be the true voice. It is this sense of exploration in his work. It makes me think of the comment of Jose Gorostiza, another neo-Baroque poet. When he talks about poetry, he says how it comes from the force of the human spirit, which remains non-moving, crucified in its profound isolation. But despite that isolation, it can amass treasures of wisdom, travel along roads of freedom. And one of those roads is poetry, where one can create without fabricating, and one can remain at home and yet travel across different dimensions across the world. So to finish with, I'm going to read one of the poems that I love by Will. It is taking place inside of the termitary among termites. I don't know how he wrote this. I'd like to think it was influenced by this wonderful book by Eugène Marais called The Soul of the White Ant. The termite is called the white ant in Africa. And I'm going to read it. It's not too long. And again, you will hear all of the characteristics I was speaking about. So within the opaque termites morass, they of collided pincer malfunction, of egregious clashings of dread, of the privity of corroded malarial witness, embedded in a boiling worm foundation. This life conducted in a smoky, aurific substratum, fed by miraculous enmity, by seismic fault, by riddled tarantula mound, by blank tornado morass, each haunted aspiration within imploded flanks of soil, within its rotted neon stochastic. And these implosions burn and scatter their inversions as if wheat were being pictured in the elusive flash of primordial fungus, crystallized by acidic fallopian fate, by a forge of molecules, scattered as oblivious distraction. This life which functions as a limitless biochemical mortality, as an alchemical ridge or an asteroidal morgue, they who eat flames from exploded rain sieves, who take as statues vicious armaments of wood, under blank absorption suns, moving like a voracious flood of pale neutrino trout, stunning, invulnerable, like a scurrilous cortical mimetic beneath a flask of exploited grain in a well, or a cloudy reptilian salt where generic abasement burns and ghostly electrodes extend into treeless electrical shocks and gullies. And from this intensity, a leap of telepathic kindling from the poles of Alpha Centauri, from a pre-existent wormwood, from a riveted fire on Callisto, therefore, from old oppositional lightnings, from its fleece of flaming thistles, there comes to exist an alien iridium lantern with its instantaneous beam, which penetrates the thorax, which coils and recoils the termites' impact antennae as they ceaselessly inflame the wrenching leonine souls. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, hello to everyone, and especially to Will.
Thank you.
It's a great pleasure to be with all of you celebrating Will Alexander. I'd like to focus on an area of his work that seems to be the least noticed in an odd sort of inversion, and it creates a riddle of sorts. And I'm talking about his blackness, or the extremity of his blackness, the deep and abiding roots of Will Alexander's writing in Black American tradition. So I'll speak a little bit about that and then offer some concrete examples of exactly what I mean. Now, Black American writing emerges from centuries in the United States and elsewhere throughout the Americas, in which literacy was punishable by death, right? So we're looking at this massive archive of history, of understanding, of joining and growth, but also the preservation of the human spirit, which remained intact up to this day, which any cursory study of the institutions variously of slavery will note was never meant to happen. This was never meant to happen. Spirituality among the Africans, part of the theological proposition of slavery is that that didn't exist. So how does that pair up with Will Alexander? Well, we're looking at Black American writing, one of its unique characteristics, which is emerging from centuries, again, I'll repeat, in which literacy, reading and writing, was punishable by death. And so serious was this law taken that even the person who taught the African to read and write was also punished with death. So this massive archive, this being of knowledge, not just the knowledge itself, but the mode of its transmission, became embodied in the music and in the orality of the Africans in the Americas, right? So even before the beginnings, after the end of legal slavery, when Black Americans were allowed to practice literacy, there already existed an enormous body of knowledge, different modes of consciousness, and different ways of deciphering and interpreting history, their own, that were already damaging critiques of the institutions which had enslaved them. They were available in rhythm, in melody, in song, and an orality. Now, orality, as compared with literacy, of course, has a supple feeling that cannot be fixed in the way that literacy fixes the word to the page. So we're talking about not only what I've already outlined, but also a very extreme contrast between different ways of organizing time and space. Linearity, which is necessary for the literate world, right? And orality, which is a non-linear aspect of language. So I want to look really carefully at that, because I think that these things really underline and emphasize some of the characteristics of Will Alexander's work. Now, I mentioned this aspect of deciphering and interpreting history and the critique that it offers that's unique to Black American writing. It's part of what is revealed or disclosed in Will's work when we note or feel or come into contact with its extraordinary force of propulsion. There is, in Will Alexander's work, I think all of us would agree, this very propulsive, rhythmic, forward-leaning momentum. And those characteristics, which are shared in, again, I'll refer to it as an archive of the pre-literate or the orality of the African in the Americas, expressed in the music, most specifically jazz music, which a number of people have brought up, and which Will himself has indicated as being one of the sources of inspiration for his work. But perhaps more saliently, for the individual, the poet, the writer, the storyteller, who is emerging from this historical space, and again, centuries-long historical space, in which they would be facing death by writing down a record or becoming literate, the approach or the point of view that is expressed in terms of the relationship to language is completely different than cultures of people, individuals, writers, etc., who are coming from literate societies. The idea or the conception of the capacity for language to gain and maintain power, to express the revival and the resuscitation of the human spirit, to keep it intact. We've heard from people today about that quality of Will's work, which helps us to remain spiritually intact, to be able to revive and resuscitate an image of our relationship to the world that allows for that holistic integration with ourselves in the universe. And part of that extraordinary capacity in Will's work, of course, is that he acknowledges the illusion of singularity created by the body, right? He doesn't go along with this idea that we are one self, but rather many in dialogue with each other, emerging into a space of joining and growth. And my point, moreover, is that those characteristics and others that I'll mention in a moment are indicative of the tradition of Black American writing, in the Americas, throughout the Americas, and especially in the United States. I talked about the propulsive sense, the forward-leaning sense, the rhythmic leaning into time and space, into the past, present, and future, as if it was happening at once, right? The attitude towards the language, the point of view on language. But also, if you would look at the line on the page and transliterate that to musical notation, one of the things that comes up right away is this extreme level of syncopation. There is an extremity of a percussive element in Will's work. Now, I look forward to possibilities in the future when composers, might take this on as a task. But I think it's worth serious consideration when examining some of these elements that are related to the blackness of his writing, the fact that it does emerge from a historical and cosmological space that is African, and that it does, like the tradition preceding him, offer the kind of critique of the institutions of the West that not only sustained and abided by slavery, but continue to do so. And this is not just, being cut out of whole cloth. There are many people, as we look back into the history of not just literary criticism, but anthropological work. I'm thinking of people like Zora Neale Hurston and her contributions to Nancy Cunard's famous anthology of Black writing, specifically the essay by Zora Neale Hurston, Characteristics of Negro Expression. I'll give you a couple of examples of what Hurston shared with us, and I think you'll understand right away what I'm talking about when I refer to its relationship to Will Alexander. One of the things that came up just a few moments ago has to do with adornment, the elaboration or almost celebration of the volatility of language, to give it its color and rhythmic character and expand upon its possibilities melodically and rhythmically. And to that extent, on a separate point, I think Will's line, if you will, probably has more fidelity with artists like Eric Dolphy, also of Los Angeles, California, than it does of John Coltrane, just in terms of that adornment of the word, of the line, of the capacity of language. So getting back to Zora Neale Hurston in her famous essay, one of the things she talks about unique to Black American expression, the double descriptive, high, tall, low, down, top, superior, kill, dead, chop, axe, speedy, hurry, more great and more better, or the use of verbal nouns. She features somebody I know, funeralize, sense me into it, puts the shammery on him. I wouldn't friend with her, ugly in a way. And the use of nouns as verbs, won't stand a broke. She won't take a listen. That's a lynch. And in the blues tradition, since we're speaking about music and jazz, of course, there is one of Ted Jones' favorites, will shut my mouth wide open. So I think that these help us to examine some of the unexpressed but intended and unintentionally expressed ideas and concepts and feelings and emotions that oscillate in Will Alexander's work. And I am suspicious that the reluctance to acknowledge the Blackness of Will Alexander's work and its origins in Black American tradition, some of which I've touched on, we don't have enough time to get into all of it, have to do with the, on one side, the morbid fascination that the United States of America has with Black cultural expression. And part of that morbid fascination being the overwhelming desire to control it and to stabilize it within the imagination of we'll call it a nation, and to give it a character that is reflective of what it imagines it to be. And since Will is clearly, again, writing out of a tradition that is pre-Columbian, pre-European, and has its roots in antiquity in Africa, this really troubles the water as far as his reader's ability to align this constellation, which I'm hoping to offer some of you here today. And there's a lot more territory to go into that. I'll since we don't really have a lot of time, I'll just leave it at that for now. But I hope that as we continue into the discussion this afternoon, some of us might allow ourselves to return to a few of the ideas that I've brought up, and hopefully look for a chance to strengthen our roots, not only with Will Alexander's vision, but with its continuity in how it emerges from this unique historical time space that is so very vital, not only to letters and music, but often all of the economic, political, and social needs and challenges of our time. I do, before ending this, I do want to be very clear about my use of the word jazz. I'm not necessarily talking about music per se. I mean, that's fine. But the reality of jazz is that it's many forms from within the music itself extend into modes of consciousness, ways of interpreting reality, perhaps best understood by the interpretive stance from within existing compositions. If you look at American popular song, for example, from 1900 to 1950, why is it today that we still know Cole Porter, George Gershwin, Irving Berlin, Harold Arlen? It's because of improvisation, of the unique capacity of the improviser in the jazz tradition to take the material and offer a powerfully deciphering attitude of its inner qualifications and how it might illuminate the present time. And that's very much what Will is doing aesthetically. And I'll just leave it there. Thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you.
Will, you want to take it away?
Well, I can do that. I'll start with a portion of Divine Blue Light for John Coltrane. And you can take it away from here after I do the portion. I'll do synecdoche as opposed to the whole poem. It would be too much time and space, and we don't want to verbally blind the circumstance. Divine Blue Light, I call it sudden, ungraspable nomadics. Not as phantom blinding, but soils of Mount Meru, as quantum, as perpetual, as interdimensional kindling. Its hemispheres colliding, as bricolage, as osmosis, as sonic notation, alive as sonic commentary phantoms, understood unto themselves as stratospheric particulates, not merely as tense foundational structures, as a pronoun to be levied as simple sonic ramification. You understood this to be in the infinity of your hearts, to be microscopic musical grammar, not unlike phosphates, as a syntax of symmetry, resounding as an obverse mirroring of chords. Analogous to 16th notes, rising and scattering of the Rona chord, much like the residue from diamonds that bake. Not simply shrill supplication as noise, but as spectral realms of themselves. Being sonic blinding bodies that rise and loop and gather themselves on the other side of themselves. Not as artifact or translated merger, but as exploration, summons, so that the sonic never wizens by pursuing entangled osmosis as complex utopian turquoise. And it was on this plane that you and Dolphy squared Private Comet into thrilling electrical prophecy that both forged and scrambled light, so that amperage split apart and scattered across soil as interregnum, being blizzards of grammar, not merely emitted from bodies, but sound as hail from unknown wizardry as that sired sonic thoughts and streams, understanding such flow as transmuted acre. That was my part of this longer poem. And I hope that the synecdoche came through, even though my voice was gravelly, but I hope the sonic comment overall had some kind of percussive, alchemical content to it. I'll try some other smaller poems if that's fine under these conditions. Montric Blizzard as Space from the same volume of Divine Blue Light. A continent that has made a covenant with its own ruin, has made the skies starve, has made stone momentarily disadvantage itself. Its circumstance, deeper than tremors, remains equational habit, miming itself via counted tablets of time. Not a Montric blizzard of space into empty air, but every piece of ice as mathematical symbol. Not living quotient, but a dazed nutrient gone awry, or dark veering, stumbling over its own loins. And because I am at nerve's end, I can only breathe mantras and live within. The whole idea is for the poet is to live with inside of himself or herself and brew diamonds in the spirit so that they come out fully formed as lingual artifacts. It's a transformative reality as a poet. You're always up, down. There's no squared figure where you can just assemble yourself off into a hiding space, but you're cross-circulating across this total reality all the time. And so in my latest poems, I've been able to literally hear my work like no other time. There's little principal cognitive contact with the language. They just well up inside of me and they begin to form. And the poems just have been coming out. I guess Andrew Duran and I got together earlier in the last month to play some music. But during that trip, I was able to almost write 48 for full 48 hours. So I practically finished the whole volume during that time period. And it was like non-exhaustive, but it was just the words coming out all the time. It's just getting in that river of poetry and beginning to float, to not try to fight the stream, but float within it. So here I am floating within this new stream And I thank you all for coming and participating in my work. And if there's more to be said, I don't want to continue to read poetry and talk about poetry by just reading poem after poem after poem. That would go on too much time, for too long over time. So we'll just get to the synecdoche of the situation, because we need vision more than we need artifacts. We need the vision of language, not the artifact of language. Who's assembling a new book and who's going to do this and who's going to present this where and how do you memorize this and present that? We're not into like being an entertainer, but being a person that conscripts, works with reality to such a degree that it begins to penetrate into what we call the unknown, what I call the unknown. And language can begin to heal not only one's inner self, but whoever is in contact with that healing. And so it's like a plural situation. You don't just individually go out, but you just put the poem out, not as an artifact, as I said, but as a living tremor that scales all the shores of the earth. And I'm going to leave it at that at this time. I don't want to burden too much, but read the books, and they're always in motion. Books are always in motion for me all the time. So it's not just a situation of writing a book, but getting into that river, staying in that river and beginning to form energies from that original tremor of language, which is, as Justin pointed out, an African condition on planet Earth, because all knowledge has literally come from Africa. It's not an ideological statement, but when the Greeks came down to Egypt, it was like 332 BC. It wasn't original. So they were learning, like Herodotus and others talked about the originality of the Egyptians rather than the originality of the Greeks and Pythagoras. And this is something that Cheikh Anta Diop has gainfully pointed out over time and space. But it is true. And this is the real medicinal quality of language. To me, is like a healing factor that was understood in the rhythms of the universe, that the Egyptians were able to understand, not just cognitively, but as a whole spiritual energy field. And so that's what I'm interested in, is replenishing and working with energy fields, listening to energy fields. And so that comes through my language, is the pure listening of energy fields, way beyond the calculation of the Anthropocene and the piecemeal fantasia of knowledge. In fact, I have a new book that's coming out this fall on Islamic education that prevailed 1,000 years ago. It's a book, some of you may have heard about it. I've talked about it a little bit. It's called On Dar el-Hikmah, which Dar el-Hikmah is this educational institution that was founded in Cairo in 1005 by Caliph al-Hakim. And he seeded the original collection in 1005. And this all the information on botany, medicine, poetry, all these things were included. And this is the foundation of the modern institution of higher learning in the West, founded by Muslims and Jews during that period. Salamanca, all of those institutions that I can't name off the top of what's Occidental, the Oxford University, Bologna, Coimbra. These things were founded during that time period, which remain foundational to the higher institution of learning in the West, which has been foreshortened by the West in terms of where the sources were garnered from. But anyway, I want to emphasize the fact of rhythm and the energy of non-calculation in my work, and getting the actual medicine of listening and hearing onto the page. So again, I want to thank everybody for participating in this gathering here for my work. And I want to thank all of you. And if there's any questions, I'll do my best to approach them. I don't want to just say answer, but to approach a question, not to just answer a question, but to approach it so you get to whole nutrient out of what's being asked. The fact is, you have to get into a circulation of energy, of lingual energy, to begin to produce poetry. You just don't produce it just off of a paper and you scratch this off and check that check mark, and that it's not check mark poetry, but it's something that does happen, but you can't describe it. It is a mystery. I don't know what I'm going to write down all the time. It's true. And I'm not trying to cognitively balance the situation, but to let it come out. And sometimes it'll come out as a poem or essay or a play, whatever it's going to do, but I let it do what it's going to do. I don't want to just mesmerize myself with some kind of cognitive articulation. So thank you for cognitively doing the non-cognitive work with my work. And I just want to thank everybody's expertise and appreciation of what I've done so far.
Will, you're reminding me of, we had a conversation talking about what we can do for releasing the book, and the way you're talking now is reminding me of it. You had this great line. You said we have to, and I can't remember if it was wedge or lodge. I can't remember what the exact words was, but basically we have to get it in the craw of a distracted populace.
Yeah, that's what we're dealing with, a distracted populace all the time.
Yeah, and as you're talking, and I think anybody here would be happy to listen to you read for another hour. I feel confident saying that, and I'm also hearing what you're saying about it in these moments. It is about this kind of exchange, and that's how we get these things. You get the hook, you get it in your craw. You kind of
Exactly.
to keep turning it over and going deeper. We do have a question from Heller Levinson. I know another friend of yours. So I'll read the question, and then you can approach it however works. Heller writes, on page 121 of the Coming Mental Range, you ask, what are the options? And then crescendo imagistic radiance with or further still, a hurricane of half-lawns appearing and disappearing in and out of incountable dimensions. To what extent do you view the shimmering image as a consciousness elevator, as one of the options enabling transmundane iridescence?
Well, it is transmundane iridescence, because we're not talking about bringing some wood from a tree, but we're talking about a living energy that's circulating. And to me, these ideas of these particles, these nanoparticles that I talk about here, or like certain states along the way to what the indigenous mind calls the invisible. And so without the scientific enclosure that seems to wall the information off from circulation in the mind body. But for me as a poet, to put all these energies from these so-called scientific calculations into a living element that flows throughout the body, that doesn't promote ruin, but to promote healing, lingual healing, I should say. So anybody that picks up some work without even knowing who wrote it, not knowing me, but feeling the lingual heat, the lingual healing that takes place is one reads that, not just in this time frame, but across time and space. Outside of this time and space, and this region of time that we're in today, but or outside of what's considered to be my personality, but the way that these energies range in terms of a certain kind of a heat, kind of a momentum that is beyond calculation. So I just want to just stay beyond calculation all the time. I never calculate. So I don't know if that's enough, but we'll just leave it at this and take another question if we have it.
I like that comment, Marcella, just to note that, say that out loud, from the calculation is often precursor to exploitation. Yeah. I don't know if you want to say
Well,
anything within that, Marcella, or anybody else from the panel. We have a question: when can we expect treason in the Northern Theater to appear?
That's kind of up in the air, but that's one of the areas of my work that I've had it's been like not it's been good, but I've written the work, but at a certain point, there may be some opportunities to perform it, although it's been done a couple times and worked well, but maybe it's something that the theater is not ready for at this time. I'm not saying putting but it's just not my idea to put myself on top of the world, but to explore the world through the theater or through whatever medium I'm working with. And I've been fortunate that all of these books have been coming out, and so they'll be there for the future. We're not interested just in what the contemporaries say, but what the work does over time in space. And bringing this gathering together today has been great. Just knowing that all of you guys are out there, and I've been able to explore my own consciousness in such a way that it's scripted into the general, start to script itself into the general consciousness.
I actually would love to hear, so I'm supposed to be writing a paper on your work, and I've been thinking about measurement and measurements and kind of what I see is anti-measurement. And this may speak a little bit also to Justin's idea of that people were measured for slavery. Everything about them was measured as for the future extraction of their energy and labor. And but you've been talking about calculation, and now I'm thinking about calculation, the difference between calculation and measurement. So I'm wondering if you can talk about that a little bit more, what the calculation is about. Is it like calculating that sort of movement towards assessment of how to take, perhaps, and how to solidify things for the taking? Anyway, I'd be interested in hearing more about calculation.
Non-measurement for me is not an ideological understanding, but a natural understanding. My understanding is, it's not a utopian one, but everything that we know comes from the cosmos, doesn't come from us. And for a particular people, a European set of advances that have completely circled the wagons to such a state and taken from the cosmos and put it into a category that only they know. It remains a problem. It remains a problem. And so, everything I read about outer space, they're trying to rope a certain kind of motion that is pro-European. But we are finding out from the universe that there can't be anything like that, because Musk is talking about, instead of going to Mars, he's talking about going out to Alpha Centauri. Almost, it's unbelievable. Not laughable, but it is a problem. It is a problem.
But you're so right that he wants to escape, that he wants to flee and establish his own private Idaho, right? The white supremacist pure, and that exists. I mean, he doesn't know it only exists inside his own little.
Yeah, you mentioned Roanoke, that early settlement with the people that I wrote about earlier, that you read earlier, but Roanoke was an abandoned colony. And you're going out into the heavens. There's no supermarkets out there. And I'm not being mundane about that, but you can't go for a tank fill up. What do you do? So in other words, the way this situation is set up, I don't see it. It feels fatigued from the beginning, from the start, from the outstart. So this fatigue is sitting into the whole culture. That's really weak right now. So that's what I've been doing these meditations on, this internal weakening of the culture, and what's going on with all the ups and downs. There's so much information to write about, but at the same time, you're dealing with a certain kind of a trend that's leading towards the whole incalculable demise. It's transpiring moment by moment. Even as we speak today, there's this demise is taking shape. It's like symbolic of the bridge that fell in Philadelphia a couple of days ago.
Yeah.
It could be any place, but it seems to be happening all at once.
Well, we have a question from the chat that's asking about your overlap or interaction with other Black artists in 70s and 80s Los Angeles, such as David Hammons, filmmakers, and the LA Rebellion, etc.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm still conversing with Kamal Dawood. We grew up together, and there's legions of people that I've gathered. Kate Curtis Lyle, who's here, and it's been a legion of incredible beings that I've been privy to. It's been like very rich, very, very intensely rich. So I've been able to take all that energy in and synthesize it to such a degree that my Africanness has been able to come out. And it's like John Coltrane said, his sound was like weeds just popping up out of the pavement. It's pure energy. And this is the way that I'm working all the time with language. Weeds popping up out of the pavement, unbidden, all the time. And some people call me a surrealist, but I'm not an ideological being, but as Justin was talking about, a percussive being. So I hope that answers something or touches on something for the questioner. But any more comments, I will be willing to field.
Anything from any of our panelists? Any other comments or questions? It was just making me think, Will, that your answer to that question about working on the glossary with you for the coming mental range, which eventually that section titled Electrical Grammar, and just the sort of the range of that, and kind of coming to the decision to sort of present it as a field, really, rather than any sort of conventional glossary. But
I agree with
so names and places, and it's people and across time, and I love that about how what you included in that glossary, that it sort of brings everything onto this same plane in a way.
Well, the thing is to bring energy together, not split it apart. That's, for me, is not a scale of value where I stack one thing on top of the other, but to let things flow and interact as if there were no human consciousness here, but the way that nature works itself naturally the way it works. It just works on its own. It doesn't require us to do anything with it. This has been one of the tragedies of the whole era, is that nature has been subscribed to do something for the northern elite for the past 250 years. And that's what Gerald Horne was talking about. Enlightenment was, but for who? Wasn't for the people from the southern cone, but for a portion of the planetary cone, which is still a damage that's still working psychically on all fronts at this time. And that's part of the planetary confusion that we have today. The planet is transitioning into another space, but because of the Europeans are not condoned to carrying out the future as they once did, like, I guess his name is Ned, I can't think of Ned's last name, the American Indian writer who wrote The Discovery of America. It's a new volume. It's a great volume. It's about the American Indian culture. These are in the Americas, and how it's been so altered and transmixed with stunning and negating forces that have been, coming out of the Puritans or the Spaniards. But America is this great melting of this great homogeneous energy. It's my theory that say if the mentality of Granada in 1032, 1054 had went full scale with the American Indian consciousness at that time, where would we be at as a species? That's one of my themes in my next book coming out. That where would we be at if the American Indian had have been able to meld with the African and the European consciousness? And this has been something that it's been on my mind for some years now with the working on this book on Dar el-Hikmah, and how the universities have subverted this idea of wholeness into these particular parts that they grade you on so you can jump into industry. How do you take this nutrient and blend it into a being, like they did at the Greeks call it Luxor, I think they did, but it was actually endemically called by the Egyptians Wosei, Luxor, where the whole element of the being was transmuted by fields of knowledge. So this is what I'm interested in with my work here, is to put all these elements into the work, wherever it comes out, if it's a poem, or if it's an essay, or if it's a play, all of these things come out. I mean, they're poised to come out, but they do surprise me. I don't have a script. There's no script. There's no turning the page to do something I've already done. Never, never, never. So I'm always looking for new avenues of expression. Never being satisfied. I know what Justin was talking about with Eric Dolphy, because of this continuous work, this work ethic comes up, just naturally comes up, just one. I've always heard something beyond what I've done, as Dolphy puts out. So you never know what you're going to come up with. That's why the living element of poetry is miraculous all the time. And so I thank you for allowing me to season the airways with this commentary. And if there's anything else that would like to be added.
We have an interesting question. Will, do you have a personal system of color association? If so, can you discuss?
Whoa, that's very cognitive. I can't do it. I really can't. It just happens on its own.
Yeah.
But that's a good question, but you can't, for me, I can't separate things out.
Yeah. Yeah.
But you know, my mind, I've always had this cognitive issue as a so-called student. I was never, my mind is so naturally non-linear that they thought I was a little off the charts because I don't associate with linearity as such, you know, and this is how the schools are scripted to grade you so you can go into industry and go into a lockdown psychological state as an expertise. And as I point out, and I'm not an expert on anything. I think the late Malcolm X talked about that. And I'm not an expert on anything, but I put things like Bucky Fuller says, you have to be a general comprehensivist. You do have to be a general comprehensivist. He said that the old sailor, the old captain would swab a deck, shoot a gun, or cook a meal. You have to be able to do all these things at one time, or attempt to do these things at one time. So that's what I'm attempting to be, like an old sailor.
That seems like a particularly nice idea to end on.
Okay.
But I just, unless there's anything, any last comments from anybody?
I had a question.
Yeah, go ahead, Justin.
Will, I'd like to return to the text that I was quoting from Zora Neale Hurston a little earlier.
Sure.
And as I mentioned, this is some work that she contributed to Nancy Cunard's famous Negro anthology, which
Sure.
has been cited quite a bit in recent studies of Black surrealism. But I want to just quote a specific sentence from Zora Neale Hurston's famous essay, and then just get some of your response to it before we close out. So she says, action, everything illustrated. So we can say the white man thinks in a written language and the Negro thinks in hieroglyphics. Could you respond to Zora's assertion?
Well, she's talking about poetic context, poetic energy, internal energy. It's not an external situation. It's like the blues, it comes out. It's a natural thing. It's like the way stars come out. They turn into constellations, but they're already there. You know, we preclude literary precedent in this sense. You know, it's non-white people in this continent. You know, we're coming up out of this magma of energy. That's why it's so many surprises all the time. All the time. It upsets the apple cart. So we're interested in what I'm doing with poetry is not just upsetting the apple cart, but surprising myself. And this is just energy that comes out. So many new things have been discovered with the, what's the latest, the Hubble telescope situation. But, you know, these things are already there. Why are they new? But the culture itself hasn't permitted these unexpected incidents to transpire because of the way it's been held back into a European stronghold. But it doesn't get into the medicinal aspects of how do you put things together? How does medicine really work? The language has to be like medicine. Unscripted, can't be dulled down and shunted off into a prescription. You can't do that. If you don't have any lyrical momentum, what do you have? You have a cognitive sterility.
It reminds me a few years back, NASA here in the United States determined that the vibration, the sound, if you will, of a black hole was the blues in B flat. It reminded me immediately of you, Will.
Yeah, when Sleepy John Estes, you know, the river was whiskey, I'd be a diving duck. He just naturally, he goes back to nature, you know. And this is what birds do when you see them fly, or you know, the animals in the forest. they have this natural grammar. So it's not an educated grammar, it's a natural grammar from which the educated learn, so-called educated learn. So here we are.
Beautiful,
Thank you for that.
beautiful.
Thank you, Will.
Thank you. Thank you
Thank
guys for being here.
Yeah, thank you for all your work. It's
Thank
such
you
a,
for all of you guys' energies and your interesting insights. And thank you again,
yeah.
you in particular, Stacy, for this Tracy, for this sensational conclave.
Yeah, I'm so glad, grateful to everybody for participating and just glad we could come together now. And I look forward to and in person in the future, I hope. I know you've got so much more coming along, Will. So I look forward to continuing the conversation, getting it stuck in the craw of more of the distracted populace.
It will be. I'm working on new work right as we speak.
Yeah, yeah.
It doesn't stop because I'm doing new work, just tremendous stuff that just comes every day.
Yeah.
So
Fantastic.
it's ongoing. So
Great.
thank you guys again for all your expertise and your insights.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you guys. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you for being here.
Thank you,
Thank
Will.
you.
So great to see you.
Good
Hope
to see you guys.
soon.